Konnichiwa minasan, and welcome to the class in the second lecture series on Introduction to Japanese Language and Culture. This is our 32nd lecture, and in our last lecture we learnt about question words, about expressions. Some expressions we had done earlier, like in our restaurant expressions. So, from those expressions we learnt how to use particle mo with the question words, what it means and how it is to be used. So, we could not complete a lot of things last time. We are going to start from there for one, and then we will do something new. I will tell you about Sumori and about Hoshi. So, what are these two words, how they are to be used, what is the construction we are going to do today. Before that, we are going to listen to kaiwa as we always do. So, very quickly let us listen to the kaiwa and see what is there for us.
皆さんは辞書が欲しいですか？
はい、そうです。実は先週から日本語の勉強を始めたので、いい辞書を買いたいです。
英和辞典の方がいいですか？和英辞典の方がいいですか？
そうですね。やっぱり毎日新しい言葉を習うから、最初に英和辞典を買いたいです。
私も英和辞典の方がいいと思います。
私は昨日本屋に買うつもりで行ったけど、どれがいいかよく分からなくて買わなかったです。
そうですね。どんな辞書でもいいと思いますよ。私は先週この辞書を買いました。とってもいいですよ。
すいません。ここに辞書の名前を書いてください。これから本屋に行って私も同じ辞書を買います。どうもありがとう。
So, you just heard the kaiwa, and there are a few things, as I told you just now, which are new. So, let us see what they are. 私は今会話を読みます。ラオさんとミラさんの会話で今日は新しい言葉がたくさんありますから、皆さんよく聞いてください。ミラさんは辞書が欲しいですか？はい、そうです。実は先週から日本語の勉強を始めたので、いい辞書を買いたいです。英和辞典の方がいいですか？和英辞典の方がいいですか？そうですね。やっぱり毎日新しい言葉を習うから、最初に英和辞典を買いたいです。So, let's do this first. So, there is this word Hoshi. Now, Hoshi means I want something. And before Hoshi, you see there is ga. Of course, we are going to do Hoshi in detail later. Jisho ga hoshi desu ka? Do you want a jisho? Hai, so desu. Jitsu wa senshu kara, from last week, Nihongo no benkyou o hajimeta node, I have started studying. Thus, ii jisho o kaitai desu. You have done, so I want to buy. Ewa jiten no hou ga ii desu ka? Wae jiten no hou ga ii desu ka? So, A desu ka, B desu ka, isn't it? So, A desu ka, this is a comma. This is a pattern, and that is what we are doing over here. Do you want this or do you want this? So desu ne. So, she is thinking over here. So desu ne. Which one should I buy? Yappari. As is to be expected. As should be. 毎日新しい言葉を習うから。Because I am learning. 習う is learning. から because reason 最初に in the beginning. 最初 is start, beginning. So, it is a time expression. So, thus particle ni. There will be some time span for saisho in the beginning. So, thus it is a time expression and we will use particle ni. 英 eiwa jiten o kaitai desu. What is eiwa jiten? Eiwa jiten is English Japanese dictionary. We have done it earlier, and wai jiten is Japanese English dictionary. Watashi mo eiwa jiten no hou ga ii to omoimasu. I also think English Japanese dictionary will be better. I also think. We have done to omoimasu in detail. So, as you know, before omoimasu, to will always come. Kino honya ni Sumori de itta kedo, dore ga ii ka wakaranakute kawanakatta desu. So, kino honya bookstore ni for itta ikimashita. Sumori, this is a new word. We are going to do this also in detail. De itta kedo, I went over there with the intention of buying, but dore ga ii ka, so there were a lot of them, which was better, which was good, which was not good. Dore ga ii ka, which was better. Yoku wakaranakute, I did not know or could not figure out, could not understand, could not decide. Yoku wakaranakute kawanakatta desu. Over here, wakaranakute, wakaranai, wakaru. This is the verb. It's coming from here, wakaranakute. I could not understand, I could not decide, I did not know. So, the meaning of shiranai is also here. Yoku is lots. So, to a great extent, not lots as in number. So, I could not understand to a great extent. So, I did not buy. Donna jisho demo ii to omoimasu. Donna jisho, any jisho is all right. Any jisho demo, any one of them is okay, I think. Watashi wa senshu kono jisho o kaimashita. So, he shows a jisho and he says, last week I bought this one. So, you can look at it. Totemo ii desu. It's exceptionally, or you could say it's very good. Totemo shows degree of something. Generally is used with adjectives. So, Mira says over here, sumimasen, koko ni jisho no namae o kaite kudasai. Please write the name of the jisho. Korekara, after this, after our conversation, after I have taken the number from you, honya ni itte, ni again over here for ikimasu. Watashi mo onaji jisho o kaimasu. Me too, I will also buy the same jisho, same dictionary. So, from here you can very well make out, I have told you earlier a number of times that when purpose is very clear, then ni with ikimasu is used. So, I am sure you have understood most of it now. There are a couple of things which I want to do with you now, and we will see those. Now, you have everything in the script and all the kanjis that are given in purple. We have done those. So, you have to practice those at home. Do not look at the Roman part, try to read it on your own in the script. Take as little help as you can. I will do the kanjis with you later once again. So, now we just did Hoshi in the kaiwa. Hoshi is an I adjective and it means I want something. So, the something has to be a noun, it could be a person, it could be a thing. So, you desire something, you want to have something, to possess something. Now, you can tell what you want to have. You cannot tell about somebody else. So, this very clearly shows that you can talk about yourself using Hoshi, but if you have to tell about somebody, about third person, or about somebody else, about maybe your friend who is right here in front of you, you want to ask him or you want to tell that he wants a certain thing, then question mark will be used. The question particle ka will be used. So, you will say Anata wa nani ga hoshi desu ka? Is it all right? So, now we will see how it is done and what is important. Hoshi, as I just now told you, expresses desire or your wish that you want something. Also, when you have to ask someone as to what they want or want to know what they want, then what are you going to use? You are going to use ka and then ask the person. Anata wa nani ga hoshi desu ka? So, what is the sentence pattern? Noun 1 wa, noun 2 ga hoshi desu. This could be something which would generally be a noun. Now, all this you can read over here, it is important. The construction is va and ga, as I just wrote for you over there, and always the person or the subject will be followed by va and object will always be followed by ga in case of hoshi. Another way of looking at it is that hoshi will be preceded by particle ga always, because you know what you want. It is a fact, you are trying to say something emphatically. For example, watashi wa kuruma ga hoshi desu. So, pattern is over here wa and ga. Watashi wa kuruma ga hoshi desu. Now, if you have to ask somebody, then obviously, as I said, Mira-san wa nani ga hoshi desu ka? Nani is a question word and nani ga hoshi desu ka? So, always ga will come before hoshi. A wa B ga hoshi desu ka? A-san wa B mono ga hoshi desu ka? Or A mono ga hoshi desu ka? You can also have this A mo, B mo pattern in this form. Now, another very important thing over here, as ga is coming again and again. So, one explanation I have given you for using ga is that it is a fact. You are stating something emphatically. Now, another place where ga is very important is it is used with question words. Please remember, dare ga kimasu ka? Nani ga ii desu ka? Nani ga ii desu ka? Doko ga warui desu ka? What is not good? So, question words, dare ga kimasu ka? So, you will notice that always particle ga comes with question words. Keep that in mind and it will be easy for you to frame questions. Now, you can practice over here, watashi wa kuruma ga hoshi desu, or you can ask, anata wa kuruma ga hoshi desu ka? Otou-san wa kuruma ga hoshi desu ka? Now, there are so many things over here, sentaki, jisho, as you already know, megane and ice cream. Mariko-san is having ice cream. So, there are so many nouns over here. You can use any noun in place of watashi. Anata wa kuruma ga hoshi desu ka? Tanaka-san wa nani ga hoshi desu ka? Okaa-san wa kuruma ga hoshi desu. So, this is a statement again. Okaa-san is right there with you and you are telling somebody Okaa-san wa kuruma ga hoshi desu. So, in that case you can use hoshi, but if you have to ask Okaa-san as to whether she wants a car or not, then Okaa-san kuruma ga hoshi desu ka? Then there is kanai or one-san, oji-san, oba-san you can use, and use different nouns over here. Practice with your partner. Ask a question and answer. You also have lot of options given here. So, you can use these words and these and make small kaiwa. Now, if we have a hoshi which is an adjective, we also have a negative, this is a positive, and we also have a negative. So, what is the negative? So, we will start with adjectives. Nagai, takai. So, if you have to make a negative, you have to remove this ku, arima sen as is given over here. So, as Hoshi is also an adjective, Hoshi, so similar pattern, Hoshiku arimasen, and what is the plain form for arimasen? It is nai. So, Hoshiku nai, and that is exactly what is given over here, Hoshiku nai this in negative. Watashi wa kuruma ga hoshii desu. Watashi wa kuruma ga hoshiku nai desu. You can also say watashi wa tokei ga hoshii desu, and again tokei ga hoshiku nai desu. So, it is always watashi, I, and the important thing is particle ga. I will write it again. Noun 1 wa, please remember. Noun 2 anything. Noun 1 wa, noun 2 thing, ga hoshii this. So, the important thing is particle ga over here, it is a va ga construction. Now, you can practice. Watashi wa inu ga hoshii desu. Watashi wa inu ga hoshiku nai desu. Positive and negative. I am sure you can understand this. This is just for practice. Watashi wa boshi ga hoshii desu or hoshiku nai desu. So, in place of inu, any noun can be put. Boshi, keiki ga hoshii desu. Tanaka-san wa seita ga hoshii desu. You know that he wants, he is right here in front of you, you are telling somebody hoshii desu. So, again you can see any noun can be replaced. Now, earlier we have done verb in dictionary form plus kara and used it with other verbs to say something more. So, let us see how it is used with adjectives and nouns. So, denwa ga kita kara ikanakereba narimasen. Denwa ga kimashita. So, what is the breakup? Denwa ga kimashita. Watashi wa ikimasu. Watashi wa ikimasu. Now, when you join the two, denwa ga kita kara watashi wa ikimasu. But we also have nakereba narimasen. What does this mean? It means that I must go. I cannot not go. I have to go. It is a must. I have told you earlier as well. So, when you join the two and you are giving reason for must go, we do it with kara. So, denwa ga kita kara. It has already come. This activity is over, and because this is over and because of this activity, I have to go now. Ikanakereba narimasen. I have to go. So, verb in nakereba narimasen. So, you can use the same thing with other verbs as well, like over here you have iku, kaeru. So, kaera nakereba narimasen. Isogu, isoga nakereba narimasen. How this is to be removed and anakereba narimasen is to be put over there, which makes it a must. Even though it is in negative narimasen, but it is a must. You have to do it. That is the meaning. This is a form There is no other form. There is nothing like ikanakereba narimasu. This is in ta form, this is in plain form. So, kaigi ga hajimaru kara, it is going to start, junbi shite imasu. So, because the kaigi is going to start, thus for this reason, ima junbi shite imasu. I am preparing for the kaigi, for the meeting. Now, we will see more of this, but before that, let us quickly do nakereba narimasen properly. So, iku, ikanai, where is it coming from? Ikanai, from the negative, and ikanai, remove the I and put nakereba narimasen or kereba narimasen, whichever you want you can put. You can use taberu, tabenai, kaku, kakanai, remove the I and put kereba narimasen. So, kakanakereba narimasen, tabe nakereba narimasen. These are all group 1 and this is group 2. For group 2 you will remove ru, and for group 1 only u is to be removed, or make the negative, remove I and put kereba narimasen. Now, kaigi ga mo sugu hajimaru kara naka ni haitte kudasai. So, what does it mean? Kaigi ga, because everybody knows about the kaigi, it is going to happen right now. So, kaigi ga hajimaru kara, it is going to start. So, naka ni haitte kudasai. Mo sugu hajimaru kara. You have done sugu. Sugu means immediately, right now, within few minutes. But mo sugu means, well, not immediately, depending on what you are talking about. It's kaigi over here. So, well, mo sugu means within another 10-20 minutes, 30 minutes, it is going to start. I have done mo sugu and sugu with you in detail earlier. So, you can go check that out. For example, kaigi ga sugu hajimaru kara naka ni hairimashou. Rainen Nihon ni iku kara ima Nihongo o benkyou shite imasu. I am studying. So, iku kara, you are giving reason over here for doing this activity. If you say Nihon ni itta kara Nihongo o benkyou shimashita means it is activity of the past. Shumatsu ni jikka e kairu node. So, now shumatsu is during the weekend, jikka ni or jikka e kairu node, because I am going to return. Thus, ima, now, shigoto o shinakereba narimasen. I have to, must do the work now. Or you can also say shumatsu ni jikka e kairu node, ima gambatte imasu. Or you can say ganbaranakereba naranai. The verb is ganbaru, but you say gambaru. The M sound comes. Now, we are going to see how kara is used with adjectives. So, takai desu. Watashi wa kaimasen. Very clear, it is expensive, I will not buy. How are we going to use kara over here? Takai desu kara, because it is takai, I will not buy. Now, in past tense, so how are you going to use takai in past tense? Takai deshita. Are you going to say that? No. You will say takakatta desu. So, this is important, it comes in exams, and we as foreigners, because are not using it all the time, we do get confused. So, takakatta desu, it was expensive. thus kaimasen deshita. So, how are we going to use kara? Takakatta kara kaimasen deshita. Now, in past negative, takaku nakatta desu. Takaku nakatta kara kaimashita. It was not expensive, thus I bought it. And yasukatta kara, yasui, yasukatta, it was cheap. So, yasukatta kara kaimashita. So, I adjectives over here, how to use them. There is another example for you. Chikai kara iku. It's chikai, it's close by, so I will go. Chikai kara. Reason for going is chikai. Chikakatta kara itta. So, past activity, I went because it was close. So, again kara over here. Then chikaku nai kara ikanai. Chikaku nai. Chikaku arimasen. Watashi wa ikimasen. Chikaku nai kara ikimasen, or chikaku nai kara ikanai. Then chikaku nakatta kara, because it was not close by, I did not go. Chikaku nakatta kara, again reason ikanakatta. So, you can go over this, make different sentences and see how it is done and what it means. Now, there were some kanjis also, for example, hajimeru, very simple kanji, mu of katakana and then kuchi. So, onna no hito, mu and kuchi, hajimeru or hajimaru. Then you have chikai, again very simple over here like this, make a T and 1, 2 and 3, chikai, chikai. Then takai, of course, you have done a number of times, so you already know, and you know how the kanji has come into being. I am just making the kanjis again and again for you so that you are able to remember them. Kaimas is like this, and then there is a me over here and then like this. So, the order is 2 mays and then somebody walking for shopping, looking with your eyes and walking ahead and then buying stuff and getting it back home is cow. And at the end here we have rainen. So, rai is another reading for kuru. So, I will make it here rainen. They come in exams a lot, especially in JLPT, all these kanjis are there. Now, noun with kara, Mira datta kara ai ni itta, because it was Mira, thus I went and met her. So, it is all past and datta, datta is the past for deshita, plain form for deshita is datta, this is da. Okay, it is right here, Mira dakara ai ni iku, because it is Mira I will go and meet her, reason. So, noun over here. Ringo dakara kaimasu, ringo ga suki dakara kaimasu or tabemasu. Eiwa jiten datta kara yaku ni tachimashita, it helped. Yaku ni tatsu is the verb, yaku ni tatsu is the verb. So, eiwa jiten datta kara yaku ni tachimashita. Why jiten dakara yaku ni tata nai? Because it is Japanese to English. So, initially it is not of any help. Da kara, da is for this, datta is for deshita. Now, we have done Hoshi just now in our previous slides. So, you have done another Very similar thing with a verb. Hoshi is with noun, Hoshi, you want something, and tai form of the verb is when you want to do something. For example, watashi wa ningyō ga hoshii desu. I want a doll, noun. Ningyō is doll, and you can replace this ningyō over here with any other noun. Watashi wa tokei ga hoshii desu. Watashi wa kuruma ga hoshii desu. Watashi wa nihon no tomodachi ga hoshii desu. Nihon no tomodachi. I want friends from Japan. I would like to have friends from Japan. So, any noun can be put over here in place of ningyō. I want that noun. I desire for that noun. Now, with kaitai or verb in tai form, it is watashi wa ningyō o kaitai desu. I want to buy. So, that action is involved over here. The basic difference is that you want to do something with tai form and you just want with hoshi. Now, another difference over here, I am sure which you can see very clearly, is with hoshi ga is used, and with tai form of the verb o is used. So, in a similar manner, you can change all of this with another verb over here. You can see Nihon no mono o kaitai desu. Nihonjin no tomodachi o tsukuritai desu. I want to make Japanese friends. Nihongo o benkyou shitai desu. You cannot say Nihongo ga hoshi desu. So, please remember where to use ga and where to use o. Now, till now we have been talking about what I want, or we can ask somebody what they want directly, first person and second person. But if somebody who is not present there, if somebody who is not with you at that time, or if you know that some XYZ person wants something, somehow you have knowledge of that and you are telling someone else that so and so person wants a certain thing, then how are you going to say it? Obviously, you cannot use hoshi because it is for self or for the second person when you can ask a question. So, let us see what the word is and what the construction of the sentence is. So, I want something, or anata want something with a question. So, you have to ask a question. Now, if a third person X, Y, Z wants something and it is a statement, what are you going to say? The word is Hoshigaru. Remove the I from Hoshi and put this Garu over there. It means third person who is not present over here wants something or has wanted this for a long time. How are you going to make a sentence with it and what is the construction? Watashi wa kuruma ga hoshii desu. It is about watashi. Now, anata wa kuruma ga hoshii desu ka? This is also very, very clear that you have to ask a question, because you can only tell about what you want. Now, how will you tell about Tanaka-san? Tanaka-san wa kuruma o hoshigatte imasu. So, please remember that with Hoshigaru, the particle is particle o, and with Hoshi, the particle is particle ga. That is the most important thing, and this is always about people who are not present over there. Somehow you know what they want and you are telling somebody else, but they are not present when you are talking about it. So, that time hoshigatte imasu is used. Tanaka-san wa Nihonjin no tomodachi o hoshigatte imasu. Tanaka-san wanted to make friends or have Japanese friends for a long time. So, kuruma, you know, this kanji is very, very simple. 7-stroke character 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 stroke characters. So, today we are going to do a lot of words with kuruma, but before that I want to do tomodachi. Tomodachi is very simple like this, 1, 2, 3 and 4 over here, then make doyobi, make tatsu, 1, 2, 3 and then 1, 2 and 3. So, how many strokes to it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12. So, 12 strokes to this and 4 strokes to tomodachi makes it 16 in all. So, 16 strokes to tomodachi. We have done this character, I am just repeating it for you to know the stroke order. Now, there are a lot of kanjis with kuruma, some new words. This is shako, which is a garage. So, like this kuruma, you know, concentrate on the blue part, but this is also easy. Again, kuruma is made over here and it becomes shako, which is a garage. Then jitensha, something that goes round and round when you work on it or when you pedal it. So, jitensha, again another reading is sha, one is kuruma. Now, you have densha, you have done this, densha, I do not have to make it. The new word is kyusha, again sha, and sha means wheels. We have also seen the pictogram for it. Q means emergency, very, very fast. Sha, a quick vehicle, something that is used for emergency. Then QQ is also given over here. QQ is emergency, something that you require suddenly. And then Chusha Jo, sha is again over here. The reading kurma is used when the character is single. Only this character is used, then kurma reading is there. When it is used with other kanjis, as you can see over here, the sha reading is used most of the time. So, chu sha jo, this is where you park your cars. So, parking lot, jo is place, kurma you know, and this kanji means to reside or to put yourself over there or to park yourself over there. So, chu sha jo, where you park your cars. So, you can concentrate on the blue kanji, which is kurma, and just remember the other words. Then there are lot of sentences here for you. You can see kurma o kaitai desu, I want to buy. Kurma o kaitaku nai desu, I do not want to buy. Kurma o katte kudasai, please buy. Then kurma o kawanai de kudasai, please do not buy a car or the car. Kurma o katta hou ga ii desu, it is better that you buy a car. Kurma o kau to omoimasu, I think I will buy a car. Why I think? Because to omoimasu is I think. Then kurma o kawanakereba narimasen. So, maybe you are living in a city or somewhere where it is essential for you to buy a car. So, for commuting, so kurma o kawanakereba narimasen, I must buy a car. Then kuruma ga hoshii desu, I want a car. Kuruma o kaitai desu, I want to buy a car. Kuruma ga hoshiku nai desu, I do not want to buy a car. Then Tanaka-san wa kuruma o hoshigatte imasu. So, immediately it is third person. Somebody XYZ who wants a car. Then mae kara ototo wa stereo o hoshigatte ita. So, since long back, mae kara, from long back, ototo wa stereo o hoshigatte imashita. He has been wanting or he had been wanting a stereo for a long time. So, when Oni-san has given this or he is going to buy a stereo, then he uses this sentence. Mae kara ototo wa Swiss no tokei o hoshigatte imashita. So, my younger brother wanted a Swiss watch for a long time. So, maybe he is bought it and given it to him, or he is telling someone that he wanted to buy or he has always wanted to buy. So, I have bought this for him and will give him later. 前から弟はスイスの時計が欲しかったです。So, maybe he is in front of him, he is giving the tokei to his brother and telling somebody 欲しかったです。So, 弟 is very happy. わー、いいですね、お兄さんありがとうございました。So, お兄さん tells somebody else, 前から my brother wanted a Swiss watch. 前から弟はスイスの時計が欲しいと言っていました。He was saying that he wants a Swiss watch since long back. He was saying that. So, 前から弟はスイスの時計が欲しかったからあげました。So, he wanted it for a long time. He had told me some time back, or somehow I knew, and thus I have given it to him. And 前から弟はスイスの時計が欲しいからあげます。So, he hasn't given it as yet. Over here he is given the watch. He hasn't given the watch as yet. He is planning to give the watch to him. 欲しいからあげます。So, for future. And 欲しかったからあげました。Activity over, action over. Over here he was saying that he wants a Swiss watch. Whether he has, Oni-san has given or not, we do not know. 前から弟はスイスの時計が欲しかったです。I knew somehow that my younger brother wanted a Swiss watch since long back. So, these are sentences, same kurma and same mai kara. So, please try to understand all of this. This much we have already covered. So, I want you to be very fluent when you are doing conversation. Now, this is for you. Hoshi, hoshikunai, hoshikatta and hoshiku nakatta. So, remove the I over here and then hoshi kunai, hoshi, remove the kunai, put katta and hoshi ku na katta. So, over here you need to remove this and kuna katta has to be added. Now, you also have Hoshigaru, Hoshigaranai, Hoshigatte ita and Hoshigatte ina katta. Now, one thing you need to be very clear is the forms are there, but they are not used. This one is used more, Hoshi des and Hoshigatte ita. Now, there is something else that was there in the passage. So, I want to do that. Another word that we had in the passage was Sumori. I know a lot of time has already gone. So, what is Sumori? Sumori is a noun which shows intention or which shows plan of the person. The person, the speaker tells about his own plan, his own intention, what he plans to do. And another very important thing with Sumori is that before Sumori always the verb is going to be in plain form. So, let us see from examples what and how Sumori is used. So, you can see over here verb iku and ikanai. So, plain form negative and present positive plus Sumori always in plain form. Now, what are the sentences? Watashi wa rainen kekkon suru tsumori desu. Kekkon is wedding, suru tsumori. So, I plan to do my kekkon next year. Plan my kekkon next year. That is my intention, what I plan to do in the future. If you say suru tsumori desu. So, generally you will see that with Sumori, the speaker is talking about either future plans or about immediate actions in the present state. For example, watashi wa rainen nihon ni iku tsumori desu. So, that is my plan, that is what I have planned. Watashi wa 6ヶ月後 after 6 months 会社を辞めるつもりです。So again you will see that plain form is used over here and tsumori. That is what I plan to do. I haven't done. The action has not taken place. I am just planning. So it's still in the planning stage, or that is my wish, that is my intention. Nichiyobi ni nani o suru tsumori desu ka? So about somebody, about second person, you can directly ask, what do you plan to do? What is your intention? What is your yote? Nichiyobi ni nani o suru tsumori desu ka? So I can tell about my tsumori and I can ask someone. So now there is something very interesting over here. There is this kanji which means to tie, musubu. How is it made? It's made from ito. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. It's a 6-stroke character. And what is this? This is like doyobi and kuchi, which is kichi, which means fortune. So you tie the thread with good fortune, and this is the kanji used for kekkon. Another reading is kekko and kek and kon is another reading. So interesting kanji over here. I thought we can do it and you will remember it. This is the kanji for musubu. Then this is furui, which is old, and kaisha you have already done. Incidentally, this is also the kanji for aimasu, au. Okay. And this is ato. There was this word ato here in our kaiwa. So ato and ushiro. So remember these kanji characters. These are simple. They have come in your kaiwa and in the sentences. Do these kanji characters, and I will leave you with this over here. This was in your passage. I will do this next time. In the meantime, look up the net and see what these words are. With this, I would like to end today's class. It was a little long. There were a lot of kanjis, but you did 2 new things. You did Hoshi and you did Sumori. There is lots in Sumori still left, which I am going to cover in your next class. So in the meantime, learn what we have done today and come prepared for your next class. Arigatou gozaimashita. Mata aimashou.